The night of August 6, 2020 was an ordinary evening for most, but for the small town of Malin, Texas, it would mark the beginning of a devastating tragedy. The evening began when a rented minivan was seen driving down a desolate road under the cover of darkness. The driver, appearing to act with intent, would soon be the center of a case that would horrify the community. Hours later, a body was discovered in a muddy ditch, and what began as a missing persons case evolved into a chilling murder investigation. The identity of the victim would stun everyone. Melissa Banda, a beloved mother of 3, was taken from her family in a cruel and premeditated act of violence. The search for justice began, but the investigation soon uncovered disturbing details about the relationship between Melissa and her abuser, Richard Ford. Melissa Banda was born on February 8, 1983, to Fidel Bond and Graciela Ortega in a close-knit, loving family in Malin, Texas. Growing up in a traditional Hispanic household, she embraced the rich cultural heritage of her roots. Melissa was the second eldest of 6 children, known for her vivacious spirit, bright smile, and loving nature. Her family recalled her as a diligent student who excelled academically and was always ready to lend a hand to those in need. Melissa was fluent in both English and Spanish, and she was proud of her heritage. As she reached her teenage years, Melissa dreamed of expanding her horizons and pursuing further education. She moved to San Antonio to attend college, a decision that allowed her to grow into a confident young woman, determined to carve out a successful future. She eventually moved back to Malin, where her life would take a new direction, one that would be shaped by both love and hardship. Melissa Banda's relationship with Richard Ford began in the early 2000s, when the two met through mutual friends in Malin, Texas. Richard was charismatic, with a rugged charm that initially drew Melissa in. He was 4 years older than her and presented himself as a man who had learned from past mistakes. At the time, he was working as a welder, having served time in prison for attempted homicide, a detail he kept hidden in the early stages of their relationship. Richard had a complicated and violent past, but Melissa saw a man who, she hoped, was looking to rebuild his life. Despite Richard's criminal history, the couple's connection seemed strong. Melissa, coming from a large, tight-knit Hispanic family, believed in the importance of family and forgiveness, hoping Richard would change. Their relationship quickly progressed, and by 2008 they were married in a small ceremony surrounded by close family and friends. At the time, they were excited about the future they could build together. Over the next few years, they welcomed 3 children into the world: Elizabeth, Kimberly, and Richard Jr. Melissa took pride in her role as a mother, while also balancing her career as a district operations manager at T-Mobile. Richard, too, became a father figure, working hard as a welder to support his family. However, the realities of their marriage began to take a darker turn. Despite outward appearances of stability, Richard's temper began to show itself, and his controlling nature started to create a toxic atmosphere at home. While their marriage began with what seemed like promise, the years that followed were marked by emotional and physical abuse. Richard Ford's possessiveness and controlling behavior soon became more apparent. At first, the emotional abuse was subtle, manipulative comments, undermining her confidence and isolating her from her family and friends. As time went on, the abuse escalated into physical violence. Richard began to use intimidation and threats to keep Melissa in line. He monitored her every move, installed tracking devices on her phone, and frequently checked up on her at work. He made her feel trapped, often telling her that she would never be able to leave him or be happy without him. Melissa, who had always been strong and independent, started to feel as though she had no escape from the increasingly violent and oppressive atmosphere at home. On multiple occasions, Richard physically assaulted Melissa. These violent encounters often occurred when she would try to assert her independence or stand up to him. He would lash out when she questioned his behavior, causing her physical harm. Despite these incidents, Melissa often kept the details of her abuse private, out of fear of further retaliation. She was terrified of Richard's wrath and didn't want to expose the dark side of her marriage to her children or family. She hoped that his behavior would improve, but instead, it only got worse as the years went on. By February 2020, Melissa had endured years of escalating abuse from her husband, Richard Ford. Their marriage had started to show signs of strain almost immediately after their wedding, with Richard's temper and controlling behavior quickly becoming more apparent. Although Melissa had hoped things would improve, they only worsened as time went on. She had long been subjected to emotional manipulation, physical violence, and psychological threats. That fateful February day, an argument erupted in their home when Richard accused Melissa of infidelity, a baseless but recurring accusation that Richard used to control and dominate her. He had begun this pattern of questioning her loyalty, often without reason, and when Melissa tried to stand up for herself or challenge his accusations, the situation quickly turned violent. Richard was angry, accusing her of lying, and Melissa knew she was in immediate danger. As the argument escalated, Richard's rage took a physical turn. He shoved Melissa to the floor, and in a terrifying moment, he physically attacked her. He choked her until she lost consciousness, causing her severe injury. At this point, Melissa realized how dangerous the situation had become. She feared for her life more than she ever had before. Melissa's sister Cynthia arrived at their home later that day and found Melissa badly beaten, with bruises on her neck and arms. She immediately called the police. Richard was arrested on charges of assault, but his violent behavior wasn't stopped by his brief incarceration. After posting bail, Richard was released, and Melissa, deeply shaken and fearful, knew she had to take a firm step to protect herself and her children. Following the violent February assault, Melissa finally took the step she had been hesitant to make for years. She filed for divorce. She also took legal action to protect herself, filing for a protective order against Richard, hoping that the courts would prevent him from continuing his abusive behavior. She made the brave decision to leave her abuser, despite knowing the immense risks that could come with standing up to him. However, Richard did not accept this decision. He was not willing to let go of the control he had over her life. Despite the protective order, Richard became more aggressive in his harassment. He constantly violated the restraining order by showing up at her workplace, waiting for her outside her house, and even sending threatening text messages. The harassment intensified as Melissa continued to press forward with her divorce, and Richard began making explicit threats to kill her if she didn't drop the case and return to him. Melissa's family, especially her sister Cynthia, offered a strong support system, ensuring she wasn't alone through the divorce process. They also helped her maintain her decision to protect her children, urging her to remain firm in her stance against Richard. But the harassment weighed heavily on her, and she often felt trapped, as though she couldn't escape his relentless control over her. Melissa had been the victim of emotional abuse for so long that she found it difficult to trust anyone, but she knew that she had to continue fighting for her safety. The abduction of Melissa Banda on August 6, 2020 was the culmination of months of relentless harassment and manipulation at the hands of her abusive husband, Richard Ford. After she filed for divorce and took out a protective order, Richard's controlling and vindictive behavior only escalated. He harassed Melissa with incessant phone calls, texts, and surprise visits to her workplace and home, disregarding the protective orders in place. His obsession with regaining control over Melissa reached its peak in the summer of 2020. On the evening of August 6th, after Melissa had picked up her 3 children from a supervised visitation with Richard, she planned to visit her sister Cynthia in Malin, Texas. After a brief phone conversation with her daughter Elizabeth, Melissa parked in front of Cynthia's house. As Melissa was about to enter the house, Richard appeared out of nowhere, having followed her or possibly watched her movements. Without warning, he forced Melissa into his white minivan, violently overpowering her. Witnesses would later recall hearing Melissa scream before Richard quickly drove off with her. Cynthia, who had been in the house, grew alarmed when she lost contact with Melissa. She attempted to reach her by phone, but there was no answer. In panic, Cynthia checked the security cameras around the house and was horrified to see footage of Richard forcing Melissa into the van. Cynthia immediately contacted the authorities, launching a search for Melissa. Despite the fear and uncertainty that clouded her mind, Cynthia and the police had no idea just how brutal Richard's intentions were. What followed was a heart-wrenching search for Melissa. Authorities and volunteers scoured the area, but Richard had planned this abduction meticulously, knowing exactly how to evade the authorities. Despite all efforts to locate her, there was no immediate sign of Melissa's whereabouts. After Melissa's abduction, authorities began an intense search operation. They combed through nearby parks, roads, and abandoned properties where Richard might have hidden Melissa. Time was working against them. Every hour that passed increased the risk that Richard had taken her far away or had harmed her. Local news outlets were filled with updates on the disappearance, and the fear of the worst took hold of Melissa's family. The breakthrough came when a park ranger conducting routine patrols in a remote wooded area about 150 miles from Malin noticed an abandoned vehicle. The vehicle was a white minivan, matching the description of Richard's car. The ranger grew suspicious and reported it to local law enforcement. Upon arriving at the scene, police confirmed that the minivan belonged to Richard. They immediately began investigating the area and found evidence linking Richard to the abduction, including personal items of Melissa's in the vehicle. The police followed the trail further into the woods, and it was there, in a secluded drainage ditch, that they made the grim discovery: Melissa's lifeless body. Melissa had been brutally murdered. She had been partially buried, and evidence showed that she had suffered both physical and sexual assault. Her cause of death was determined to be a combination of blunt force trauma and strangulation. The scene was chilling. It was clear that Richard had not only abducted her, but had also planned her murder in cold blood. Melissa's family, who had been anxiously awaiting any news of her whereabouts, were devastated. They had feared the worst, and now their worst nightmare had been realized. Their beloved sister, mother, and daughter was gone. The news sent shockwaves through the community, and people began to understand the depths of Richard's violent tendency. After the grim discovery of Melissa Banda's body, Richard Ford's arrest became a critical step in the pursuit of justice. He was apprehended within days of the discovery as law enforcement pieced together the final moments of Melissa's life. Police were well aware of Richard's violent history, which had been a matter of public record, especially his history of domestic abuse against Melissa. Several months earlier, Melissa had taken out a protective order against Richard, detailing his erratic and aggressive behavior. That alone made him the prime suspect. Richard had been under surveillance even before the discovery of Melissa's body, with authorities monitoring his movements after he was seen near areas where Melissa had been last known to be. Investigators soon discovered that Richard had left a series of breadcrumbs that connected him to the crime. He had made several phone calls to friends and family in the days leading up to the murder, many of which were characterized by bizarre and delusional statements. Some of the calls included threats to teach Melissa a lesson, and others contained thinly veiled confessions of his anger and desire for control. These calls were entered as evidence during his interrogation. Richard's arrest was a matter of urgency, as investigators feared that he might flee or attempt to cover up any remaining evidence. When he was taken into custody, Richard's demeanor was cold and emotionless, which alarmed many of the officers involved in his arrest. They reported that he exhibited no signs of remorse for his actions, nor did he appear to acknowledge the gravity of the situation. This detachment only reinforced the belief that the crime had been premeditated. The police gathered evidence from Richard's home, his vehicle, and his electronic devices, all of which provided further corroboration of his involvement. Forensics teams found traces of Melissa's blood inside his minivan, linking him directly to the abduction and the crime scene. In addition, surveillance footage from various locations captured Richard following Melissa and waiting near her residence before the abduction. Digital evidence, such as GPS tracking from his cell phone, placed him at or near the location where Melissa's body was found, further sealing his involvement. As investigators pieced together the timeline, it became apparent that Richard had planned the abduction and murder for several weeks. He had researched secluded areas in remote parts of the state, which he likely intended to use as his hiding spots. He had also taken precautions to avoid being detected, such as disabling certain tracking features on his phone, though law enforcement was able to circumvent this attempt. Richard's complete disregard for Melissa's safety, as well as his willingness to engage in such violent acts, painted a clear picture of a man who was willing to do anything to maintain control. The legal proceedings that followed Melissa's murder became a focal point for both criminal justice and the broader conversation about domestic violence. As soon as Richard was arrested, the public and Melissa's family demanded justice, with many expressing outrage at how the system had failed to protect her despite the multiple reports and protective orders against Richard. In addition to the criminal case, Melissa's family pursued a civil lawsuit holding both Richard and the local authorities accountable for failing to protect her. Despite the protective orders in place, Richard had been able to continue his harassment of Melissa for months leading up to the abduction. Melissa had reported numerous violations of the restraining order, but those complaints had not resulted in any significant intervention from law enforcement. The lawsuit argued that the police had not adequately responded to the escalating threats, failed to properly enforce the protection orders, and did not take sufficient action to prevent the abduction. Melissa's family, in particular her sister Cynthia, became vocal advocates for stronger domestic violence prevention laws. The lawsuit sought damages for the emotional distress and financial burdens the family had endured as a result of Richard's actions. Melissa's death also prompted several local advocacy groups to push for policy reforms regarding how law enforcement handles domestic violence cases. This included the introduction of new measures to ensure that protective orders are enforced more rigorously and that victims have access to greater resources and support when attempting to escape abusive relationships. The civil suit, although important, could not bring Melissa back, but it raised public awareness about systemic flaws that contributed to her death. Despite the grief and anger that Melissa's family felt, they took solace in knowing that they could fight for change. They believed that bringing attention to these failures and demanding accountability would prevent future tragedies, and ultimately it helped keep Melissa's memory alive in the public's eye. The trial of Richard Ford for the murder of Melissa Banda began in the spring of 2024, drawing intense public attention due to the shocking nature of the crime and the overwhelming evidence against him. The prosecution's case was airtight. They presented a detailed account of the timeline leading up to the murder, including Melissa's prior reports of abuse, the protective orders, and Richard's escalating behavior in the months before her abduction. Key evidence presented at trial included Richard's own words, his threatening messages, his admission of anger toward Melissa for attempting to leave him, and even his statements to his friends that he intended to get even. This was supplemented by testimonies from the police officers who had investigated the case, as well as expert witnesses who discussed the psychological impact of domestic abuse and control. One of the most damning pieces of evidence was Richard's own cell phone records. His GPS tracking placed him near the location where Melissa was abducted and also in the remote area where her body was eventually found. The jury was shown chilling footage of Melissa's last moments captured by security cameras outside her sister's home, where Richard forcibly took her into his van. Richard's defense team tried to argue that the murder had been an act of passion, a spontaneous event brought on by an emotional breakdown. However, this argument was quickly dismantled. The prosecution emphasized that the premeditation involved in both the abduction and murder proved that this was not a crime of impulse but rather an act of calculated violence. The defense was unable to present any reasonable doubt, and after several weeks of testimony, the jury deliberated for just over a day before returning a guilty verdict. Richard Ford was convicted of capital murder, aggravated kidnapping, and multiple counts of assault. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The verdict brought some level of closure to Melissa's family, although it did not erase the pain of losing her. It was a small, albeit significant step toward justice in a case that had rocked the community and left Melissa's loved ones devastated. Melissa's tragic death left a void in the lives of her family and friends, but it also spurred a movement that sought to ensure that other victims of domestic violence would not suffer the same fate. Her family, especially her sister Cynthia, became active advocates for domestic violence victims, raising awareness about the signs of abuse, the dangers of controlling relationships, and the need for stronger protections for women in abusive situations. In honor of Melissa, her family established the Melissa Banda Foundation, dedicated to supporting survivors of domestic abuse and providing them with legal assistance, safe housing, and mental health services. The foundation also worked with local law enforcement to improve the effectiveness of protective orders and ensure that domestic violence cases received the attention they deserved. Cynthia and other family members became frequent speakers at conferences, schools, and public events, sharing Melissa's story in the hopes of saving lives and preventing others from going through similar experiences. Melissa's children, though deeply affected by the loss of their mother, found strength in knowing that their mother's life was a catalyst for change. They grew up surrounded by a community of support, both emotionally and financially, that allowed them to heal. Through their mother's legacy, they carried forward her values of resilience, strength, and the importance of helping others. Additionally, a memorial park was created in Melissa's honor in Malin, Texas. It served as a peaceful place where her friends, family, and the community could reflect on her life and the impact she had on the lives of others. The mural depicting Melissa's strength and beauty was also a poignant reminder of her spirit, continuing to inspire others who had experienced similar struggles. The murder of Melissa Banda is a heartbreaking chapter in the ongoing story of domestic violence in America. Her death was a senseless tragedy that highlighted the dangers of unchecked abuse and the failure of systems that should protect victims. Yet, despite the devastation, Melissa's story became a rallying cry for change. Through the efforts of her family and community, Melissa's legacy lives on in the fight against domestic violence. Her children, her friends, and her extended family continue to honor her memory by ensuring that her death was not in vain. They work tirelessly to ensure that others do not suffer the same fate she did, advocating for stronger laws, better enforcement, and greater support for victims of abuse. While nothing can bring Melissa back, her story has become a powerful tool for raising awareness about the realities of domestic violence. Her life, though cut short, continues to inspire many to take action, to speak out, and to create a future where such tragedies are prevented. Melissa Banda will always be remembered for her bravery, her love for her children, and her ultimate sacrifice for a cause much greater than herself.